car slowed to a crawl on that dusty corner of Wahoo, Nebraska, and 17-year-old Mary Kay Heese made a decision that would echo through 5 decades of silence. She glanced at the 2 men inside, recognized one of their faces, and reached for the door handle. Within hours, her body would be found on the side of a lonely road, beaten and stabbed, her dreams scattered like the March wind across the cornfields. But who were those men? Why did Mary Kay trust them enough to get into that car? And why would it take more than 50 years, a revolution in forensic science, and the relentless dedication of investigators who refused to let her story die to finally answer those questions? March 25th, 1969 began like any other Wednesday in Wahoo. The small Nebraska town was still shaking off the last remnants of winter, the air crisp but promising the warmth of spring. Mary Kay Heese woke that morning in her family's modest home on the east side of town, the same home where she had grown up alongside her siblings, where her mother made breakfast before dawn and her father left early for work. She was a junior at Wahoo High School, popular among her classmates, known for her bright smile and easy laugh. Teachers liked her. Friends gravitated toward her. She had plans, the kind of plans every 17-year-old girl has, plans that stretched beyond the borders of Wahoo into a future that seemed limitless. She dressed that morning in clothes typical for the era, checked her appearance in the mirror, and gathered her school books. Her mother, Helen Heese, I called from the kitchen that breakfast was ready. Mary Kay bounded down the stairs, her footsteps light, her mood cheerful. The family ate together, a routine they cherished, and conversation flowed easily. Her younger brother teased her about a boy at school. Her older sister asked about homework. Helen reminded Mary Kay about chores that needed doing after school. It was ordinary, beautifully ordinary, the kind of morning that families take for granted because they assume there will be thousands more just like it. Mary Kay left for school at her usual time, walking the familiar route through their neighborhood. Several neighbors saw her pass by, waving or calling out greetings. Mrs. Anderson, who lived 2 houses down, would later tell investigators that Mary Kay seemed happy that morning, see that she had stopped to pet the Andersons' dog and laughed when it tried to follow her down the sidewalk. Mr. Chen, who ran the corner store, saw her pass by his shop window. Everything was normal. Everything was as it should be. The school day progressed without incident. Mary Kay attended her classes, sat with friends during lunch, participated in a discussion about American literature in her English class. Her best friend, Jennifer Morrison, would later recall that they had made plans to go to the movies that weekend, that Mary Kay was excited about a new dress her mother was making for her, that she seemed no different than she ever had. There were no warning signs, no premonitions, no shadows creeping at the edges of that ordinary day. When the final bell rang at 3:15, Mary Kay gathered her books and said goodbye to Jennifer in the hallway. She had to stop by her locker, so Jennifer went ahead without her. That was the last time Jennifer would see her friend alive. Mary Kay emerged from the school building into the afternoon sunlight, joining the stream of students heading home. Some took the bus, others piled into cars driven by parents or older siblings. Mary Kay walked as she usually did, taking the route that would lead her back to her neighborhood. But she never made it home. Somewhere between Wahoo High School and the Heese family residence, something happened. Somewhere along those familiar streets, Mary Kay's path intersected with darkness. A witness, a woman named Dorothy Sullivan, who was driving home from the grocery store, saw Mary Kay standing on a street corner near her house. So Dorothy slowed down, thinking she might offer the girl a ride, but then she saw a car pull up beside Mary Kay. She watched as Mary Kay approached the vehicle, appeared to recognize the occupants, and climbed into the back seat. Dorothy continued driving, thinking nothing more of it. Why would she? A teenage girl getting a ride from people she knew was hardly unusual. But Dorothy's observation, that seemingly insignificant moment, would become one of the most crucial pieces of evidence in a case that would haunt Wahoo for more than half a century. She saw two men in that car. She was certain of it. Two men, though she could not see their faces clearly from her vantage point. The car was dark-colored, maybe blue or black, a common sedan of the type that filled American streets in the late 1960s. It pulled away from the curb with Mary Kay inside, and that was the last time anyone saw her alive. When Mary Kay did not arrive home by 4 o'clock, Helen Heese began to worry. It was not like her daughter to be late without calling. By 4:30, Helen's worry had intensified into alarm. She called Jennifer's house. Jennifer had not seen Mary Kay since school ended. She called other friends. No one knew where Mary Kay was. By 5 o'clock, Helen called her husband at work. By 5:30, they called the police. The Wahoo Police Department took the report seriously. A 17-year-old girl missing for several hours might have a simple explanation, but something about Helen's fear, the insistence in her voice that this was not normal, that Mary Kay would never worry her family like this, prompted immediate action. Officers began canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking questions. Had anyone seen Mary Kay? Did anyone know where she might have gone? Dorothy Sullivan heard the commotion outside her home and stepped onto her porch. When an officer approached her, she mentioned what she had seen. Mary Kay getting into a car with two men. The officer's expression changed. He radioed the information back to the station. Within minutes, every available officer in Wahoo was searching for a dark-colored sedan with two male occupants and a teenage girl, but they were already too late. At approximately 6:45 that evening, a farmer named Robert Mitchell was driving his truck along a rural road on the outskirts of Wahoo. The road was little more than a dirt path, used mainly by locals who knew the area well. Robert was heading home after checking on some equipment in one of his fields when his headlights caught something on the shoulder of the road. He slowed down, squinting through the gathering dusk. At first, he thought it might be a deer, or perhaps someone had dumped trash. But as he drew closer, his heart seized in his chest. It was a body. Robert slammed on his brakes and jumped from his truck, his legs shaking as he approached. Even before he reached the crumpled form, he knew it was bad, very bad. The body was lying face down, partially in the ditch that ran alongside the road. Robert could see blood, dark and terrible in the fading light. He could see that it was a young woman, her clothing torn, her limbs arranged in a way that spoke of violence. He did not touch her. His hands trembled as he ran back to his truck and grabbed his CB radio. His voice cracked as he called for help, barely able to form the words. Within minutes, sirens pierced the quiet countryside. Police cars, an ambulance, officers flooding the scene. Robert stood by his truck, watching, unable to process what he had found. Sheriff Thomas Brennan arrived and took charge of the scene. He was a career lawman, respected in Wahoo, known for his calm demeanor and sharp mind. But when he saw the body, even his composure wavered. He recognized her immediately. Mary Kay Heese, the girl everyone was looking for. He had hoped they would find her safe, that she would turn up at a friend's house, or that this would be a misunderstanding. But there she lay, her life stolen, her future erased. The coroner, Dr. Raymond Kowalski, I arrived shortly after and began his preliminary examination at the scene. He noted multiple stab wounds to the torso and back. He noted signs of blunt force trauma to the head. He noted defensive wounds on her hands and arms, evidence that Mary Kay had fought back against her attacker. The fury of the assault was evident in every wound, every bruise. This was not a simple killing. This was rage. News of Mary Kay's murder spread through Wahoo like wildfire. By morning, the entire town knew. Parents held their children closer. Doors that had rarely been locked were now bolted shut. The innocence of small-town life, the assumption that terrible things happened elsewhere, in big cities with big problems, had been shattered. Evil had come to Wahoo, and no one felt safe. The investigation began in earnest. Sheriff Brennan assembled a task force, pulling in detectives from surrounding counties, requesting assistance from the Nebraska State Police. They set up a command center in the Wahoo Police Department, walls soon covered with maps, photographs, timelines. Every lead would be pursued, every tip would be investigated. They would find whoever did this. They had to. The autopsy revealed the full extent of Mary Kay's injuries. Dr. Kowalski's report was clinical and precise, but the violence described was almost incomprehensible. She had been stabbed 14 times. The wounds varied in depth and location, suggesting a frenzied attack. She had been beaten about the face and head with a blunt object, possibly a tire iron or heavy tool. Defensive wounds on her hands indicated she had tried to protect herself, tried to fight off her attacker. The time of death was estimated to be between 4 and 6 in the evening, meaning she had been killed within hours of getting into that car. There was no evidence of sexual assault, a detail that puzzled investigators. Many murders of young women involved sexual violence, but that did not appear to be the case here. So, what was the motive? Why had Mary Kay been killed with such brutality? Detectives focused on Dorothy Sullivan's sighting of the car. She was brought in for multiple interviews, asked to describe everything she had seen in minute detail. Dorothy tried her best, but she had only glimpsed the scene for a few seconds. The car was dark, she was certain of that. It was a sedan, probably American-made, maybe a Chevrolet or Ford. She saw 2 men inside, one driving and one in the passenger seat. When Mary Kay got in, she sat in the back. Dorothy could not describe the men's faces. She had been too far away and the angle was wrong. But she was absolutely certain there were 2 of them. This detail, 2 men, became a central focus of the investigation. Who were they? Why did Mary Kay willingly get into a car with them? She was a smart girl, not prone to taking risks. Her parents had taught her to be cautious, so she must have known these men, or at least recognized them. She must have felt safe getting into that car. Investigators compiled a list of every man in Wahoo who owned a dark-colored sedan. They interviewed dozens of people, checking alibis, looking for connections to Mary Kay. They talked to her friends, her teachers, her neighbors. They learned that Mary Kay had been dating a boy named David Walsh, a senior at Wahoo High. And David was brought in for questioning. He had been at basketball practice at the time Mary Kay disappeared, surrounded by teammates and coaches. His alibi was solid. Detectives cleared him but continued to dig into Mary Kay's social circle. They learned that she was friendly with many people, boys and girls alike. She had no enemies that anyone knew of. No one had threatened her. No one was angry with her. She was, by all accounts, a normal teenage girl living a normal teenage life. So why had someone killed her? Tips poured in from the community. People reported seeing suspicious vehicles. They named men who gave them bad feelings. They recounted rumors and gossip. Each tip was investigated. Each lead followed to its conclusion. But as days turned into weeks, the investigation began to stall. Despite the enormous effort, despite the hundreds of interviews and the thousands of man-hours invested, detectives were no closer to identifying Mary Kay's killers. The two men in the car remained ghosts. No one else had seen them. The car had vanished without a trace. Forensic evidence from the scene was limited. This was 1969, decades before DNA analysis and advanced forensic techniques would become routine tools for investigators. They had fingerprints lifted from Mary Kay's clothing and the area around where her body was found, but without suspects to compare them to. The prints were useless. They had hair samples, fiber evidence, all carefully catalogued and stored, but again, without a suspect, these pieces of evidence could not point them in any direction. Weeks became months. The task force continued to work the case. But resources were finite. Other crimes demanded attention. Officers were needed elsewhere. Slowly, inevitably, the investigation began to wind down. Not because anyone wanted to give up, but because they had exhausted every lead, pursued every angle, and come up empty. Mary Kay's case file grew thick with reports and evidence, but it contained no answers. For the Heese family, the lack of resolution was a wound that would not heal. Helen and her husband, Frank, struggled to make sense of their loss. How could their daughter have been taken from them so violently, so senselessly? How could the people responsible simply disappear? They attended every press conference, pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. They offered a reward for information leading to an arrest. But as time passed, the calls stopped coming. The tips dried up. The town moved on, as towns do, because life continues even in the wake of tragedy. But the Heese family could not move on. How could they? Every day, Helen woke up thinking about Mary Kay. Every night, Frank lay awake wondering what had happened in that car, who had hurt his daughter, why anyone would want to harm her. Mary Kay's siblings grew up with a ghost in the house, the absence of their sister a constant presence at the dinner table, in family photographs, in the bedroom that remained untouched for years. The 1970s arrived, then the 80s. Mary Kay's case was officially classified as cold, the file relegated to a dusty storage room in the basement of the Wahoo Police Department. New officers joined the force who had not been part of the original investigation, who knew of Mary Kay's case only through departmental lore. The town had other concerns, other problems. Wahoo grew and changed. Buildings were torn down and new ones erected. People moved away and new families arrived. But those who had been there in 1969, those who remembered that terrible March day, never forgot Mary Kay Heese. In 1999, 3 decades after Mary Kay's murder, the CBS television program 48 Hours decided to do a story on cold cases in rural America. A producer named Sarah Chen had grown up hearing about unsolved murders in small towns, cases that never received the media attention of crimes in major cities. She pitched the idea to her editors. Profile several cold cases, tell the stories of victims who had been forgotten, families who still sought justice. The pitch was approved, and Sarah began her research. One of the cases she discovered was Mary Kay Heese's murder. Reading through old newspaper articles from the Wahoo newspaper, Sarah was struck by the details. A 17-year-old girl killed brutally, 2 men in a car that no one ever identified. She reached out to the Wahoo Police Department and was surprised to learn that Helen Heese was still alive, still living in Wahoo, still hoping for answers. Sarah flew to Nebraska and met with Helen. The interview was emotional and powerful. Helen, now in her 70s, spoke about her daughter with a clarity and love that had not diminished over 30 years. She described Mary Kay's personality, her dreams, the way she had lit up every room she entered. She described the agony of not knowing who had killed her child, of watching decades pass without justice. She looked directly into the camera and made a plea. If anyone knew anything at all, please come forward. It was never too late to do the right thing. Sarah also interviewed several investigators who had worked the original case. Most were retired now, but they remembered Mary Kay. They remembered the frustration of coming so close, of feeling like the answer was just out of reach, but never being able to grasp it. They talked about the 2 men in the car, how that detail had haunted the investigation. Who were they? Why had no one else seen them? Where had they gone? The 48 Hours episode aired in the fall of 1999. It was a compelling piece of journalism, and it generated renewed interest in Mary Kay's case. The Wahoo Police Department received several new tips in the weeks following the broadcast. Each was investigated, but none led to a breakthrough. Once again, the case went quiet. But Sarah Chen had done something important during her reporting. She had conducted interviews, gathered footage, collected material that captured a moment in time, voices and faces that would otherwise have been lost. Some of this material made it into the aired episode, but much of it did not. The unused footage was archived by CBS, stored away in their vast library of content. Sarah moved on to other stories, other cases, but she never forgot Mary Kay Heese. The 2000s arrived. Forensic science made enormous leaps forward. DNA analysis, once prohibitively expensive and limited in application, became a standard tool for investigators. Cold cases across the country began to be solved using genetic genealogy, the technique of comparing crime scene DNA to public genealogy databases to identify potential suspects. Cases that had seemed hopeless suddenly had new life. In 2015, the Wahoo Police Department hired a new chief, a man named Daniel Rodriguez, who had come from a larger department in Omaha. Chief Rodriguez was a proponent of using new technology to solve old crimes. One of the first things he did was review the department's cold case files. When he came across Mary Kay Heese's case, he was stunned by the brutality of the crime and frustrated by the lack of resolution. He began reading through the reports, studying the evidence logs, and a thought occurred to him. What if they could use DNA to finally identify the killers? He reached out to the Nebraska State Patrol's crime lab and inquired about testing evidence from the case. Was there biological material that could yield a DNA profile? The lab reviewed the evidence inventory and confirmed that there were several items that might contain DNA. hair samples collected from Mary Kay's clothing, material from under her fingernails where she had scratched her attacker, fibers that might contain skin cells. Chief Rodriguez authorized the testing. The process was slow. The evidence was old, stored under conditions that were not ideal for preserving biological material. But forensic scientists are skilled at extracting information from even degraded samples. In 2016, they achieved a breakthrough. They obtained a partial DNA profile from material under Mary Kay's fingernails. It was not complete, but it was enough to compare against known databases. The profile did not match anyone in CODIS, the National DNA Database of Convicted Offenders. This was disappointing but not unexpected. If the killers had never been arrested for another crime, they would not be in the system. But the partial profile could still be useful. It could eliminate suspects. It could confirm a match if a suspect was ever identified through other means. Chief Rodriguez assigned a detective named Lisa Martinez to reopen Mary Kay's case. Lisa was young, energetic, and deeply committed to justice. She had not been alive when Mary Kay was murdered, but she felt a personal connection to the victim. They were both 17-year-old girls once, full of dreams and potential. Lisa threw herself into the investigation with the kind of determination that comes from knowing you are fighting for someone who cannot fight for themselves. She began by re-interviewing everyone who had been involved in the original case and was still alive. Many of the original detectives had passed away, but a few remained. She sat with them, listened to their stories, absorbed their institutional knowledge. She tracked down witnesses, people who had seen Mary Kay on the day she disappeared. Dorothy Sullivan had died in 2008, but Lisa found Dorothy's daughter, who recalled her mother talking about the case, about seeing Mary Kay get into that car, about the guilt she felt for not doing more. Lisa also revisited the physical evidence. She studied the crime scene photographs, looking for details that might have been missed. She examined the autopsy report, the forensic analyses, the evidence logs. And then she had an idea. What if there were other cases with similar characteristics? What if Mary Kay's killers had struck before or after? Could there be a pattern? She searched through databases of unsolved murders in Nebraska and surrounding states, looking for cases involving young women killed with extreme violence. She found several, but none that seemed directly connected to Mary Kay's case. Still, she kept looking, kept digging, because that is what good detectives do. They never give up. In 2017, Lisa learned about genetic genealogy and the techniques used in solving cold cases. She attended a conference where investigators discussed recent successes using this method. The most famous was the Golden State Killer case in California, where a serial rapist and murderer had been identified decades after his crimes through DNA uploaded to a public genealogy database. Lisa wondered if the same approach could be used in Mary Kay's case. She reached out to a genetic genealogy company that worked with law enforcement. Could they use the partial DNA profile from Mary Kay's case? The company reviewed the profile and determined that while it was not ideal, it might be enough to generate some leads if they could identify relatives of the suspect. Lisa provided them with the DNA data and waited. Months passed. Genetic genealogy is a painstaking process requiring researchers to build family trees, identify potential relatives, trace lineages forward and backward in time. But in early 2018, the genetic genealogy team contacted Lisa with promising news. They had identified several individuals who appeared to be distant relatives of the person, whose DNA was found under Mary Kay's fingernails. The matches were not close enough to pinpoint a specific individual, but they provided a starting point. Lisa worked with the genealogy team to build out the family trees. They identified a cluster of families living in and around Wahoo in the 1960s. Several of these families had men of the right age range who could have been involved. Lisa began the process of locating these individuals, checking if they were still alive, whether they had alibis for the day of Mary Kay's murder, whether they owned a dark-colored sedan in March of 1969. It was tedious, meticulous work. Many of the potential suspects had died, so others had moved away decades ago and were difficult to track down. Lisa contacted relatives, explained that she was investigating a cold case, and asked if they would be willing to provide DNA samples to help eliminate their family members as suspects. Some agreed readily, eager to help solve a decades-old murder. Others were suspicious or defensive, uncomfortable with the idea of law enforcement scrutinizing their family history. One name kept appearing in Lisa's research: James Peterson. James had lived in Wahoo in the late 1960s. He had been in his mid-20s at the time of Mary Kay's murder, employed at a local garage as a mechanic. Several people Lisa interviewed remembered him, though their descriptions varied. Some recalled him as quiet and hard-working. Others remembered him as having a temper, or someone who got into bar fights, who had a reputation for being rough with women. Lisa tried to locate James Peterson. She learned that he had left Wahoo in the early 1970s, moving to Iowa. He had worked various jobs, married briefly, divorced, and then moved again. Tracking his movements over 5 decades was challenging, but Lisa was persistent. She eventually located James living in a small town in western Iowa, now in his mid-70s, living alone in a trailer park. She obtained a photograph of James from the Iowa DMV. Looking at his face, weathered by time and hard living, Lisa wondered, could this be one of the men in the car? Could he have killed Mary Kay Heese? There was only one way to find out. She needed his DNA. Obtaining DNA from a suspect without their knowledge or consent is legally complex. Or investigators sometimes collected discarded items, things a suspect touched and threw away, which could yield DNA. Lisa traveled to Iowa and conducted surveillance on James Peterson. She watched him for several days, noting his routines. He went to a local bar most evenings, drank beer, smoked cigarettes. She waited until he left one night, then entered the bar and asked the bartender if she could have the beer bottle James had been drinking from. The bartender, a woman named Maggie who had heard about Lisa's investigation, agreed. She bagged the bottle and handed it over. Lisa submitted the bottle to the crime lab. The waiting was excruciating. Weeks passed before the results came back. When they did, Lisa's heart raced as she read the report. The DNA from the beer bottle was a match to the partial profile obtained from under Mary Kay's fingernails. James Peterson had been there. He had been close enough to Mary Kay that she had scratched him, drawn his blood, left his cells under her nails as she fought for her life. But Lisa knew that a partial DNA match alone might not be enough for a conviction. She needed more. She needed to understand what had happened that day. She needed to identify the second man in the car, and she needed to build a case that would hold up in court. She obtained a warrant for James Peterson's arrest and assembled a team to execute it. On a cold morning in November 2018, Police officers surrounded James Peterson's trailer. Lisa knocked on the door. When James opened it, she identified herself and informed him that he was under arrest for the murder of Mary Kay Heese. James stared at her, his face showing confusion, then fear, then something that might have been resignation. He did not resist. He did not ask what this was about. He simply held out his hands for the cuffs. During the transport back to Nebraska, James was mostly silent. Lisa rode in the vehicle with him, watching his face, trying to read his emotions. She had arrested many people over her career, and she had learned that there were different kinds of silence. Some suspects were defiant, radiating anger and contempt. Others were calculating, already thinking about their defense. But James Peterson's silence felt different. It felt like exhaustion, like a man who had been running for 50 years and was relieved to finally stop. Back in Wahoo, James was processed and held in the county jail. Lisa let him sit in an interrogation room for a while, giving him time to think, to feel the weight of the situation. Then she entered the room, sat across from him, and began the interview. She started with the basics. Where was he on March 25th, 1969? Did he know Mary Kay Heese? Did he remember that day? James looked at her with tired eyes and said nothing at first. Then slowly he began to talk. He admitted that he remembered the day. He admitted that he had been in a car with another man. He admitted that they had picked up a girl. But he claimed it had been an accident, that things had gotten out of control, that he never meant for anyone to get hurt. Lisa listened, keeping her expression neutral, letting him talk. She knew that suspects often minimize their involvement, tried to shift blame, tried to paint themselves as victims of circumstance. But she also knew that any admission was valuable. Who was the other man in the car? Lisa asked. James hesitated. He looked down at his hands, at the table, anywhere but at Lisa's face. Finally, he said a name. Michael Garrett. Michael Garrett had been James's friend back in the 60s. They had worked together at the garage, spent time together, gotten into trouble together. Michael had been the one driving the car that day, James claimed. Michael had been the one who had wanted to pick up the girl. James had just been along for the ride. Lisa left the interrogation room and immediately began searching for Michael Garrett. If what James said was true, Michael was the second killer, so the other man in the car. She needed to find him, needed to verify James's story, needed to build a case against both men. But finding Michael Garrett proved difficult. Unlike James, who had left a paper trail through jobs and addresses, Michael seemed to have vanished. Lisa searched databases, contacted relatives, followed every lead. She eventually learned that Michael Garrett had been killed in a car accident in 1983, nearly 40 years ago. He had been driving drunk, lost control of his vehicle, and crashed into a tree. He died at the scene. This was a setback. Lisa could not arrest a dead man. She could not bring him to trial. But his death also meant that James Peterson could not rely on Michael to contradict his version of events. Whatever James said about Michael's role could not be disputed. This gave Lisa leverage. She returned to the interrogation room and informed James that Michael Garrett was dead. She watched his face carefully. James showed surprise, then something like sadness. She asked him to tell her the whole story from the beginning, and this time to tell the truth. She had his DNA. She had evidence. She knew he was involved. The only question now was how involved and whether he would cooperate. James was silent for a long time. Then he began to talk. His story came out slowly, painfully, like pulling teeth. He and Michael had been drinking that afternoon, he said. They were bored, looking for something to do. They were driving around Wahoo when they saw Mary Kay walking home from school. Michael had made a comment about her, something crude. James had laughed. Michael had pulled the car over and called out to Mary Kay. She had come over to the car and Michael had asked if she wanted a ride. Mary Kay had recognized James from the garage, had seen him around town, and she had gotten in. Lisa asked what happened next. James's face twisted with emotion. They had not planned to hurt her, he insisted. They had just been messing around. Michael had driven out of town, out toward the rural roads. Mary Kay had started to get nervous, had asked where they were going. Michael had told her to relax, that they were just taking a detour. But Mary Kay had gotten scared. She had demanded to be let out of the car. Michael had not let her out. Instead, he had gotten angry. He had stopped the car on that lonely road and told Mary Kay to shut up. She had tried to open the door, tried to run. Michael had grabbed her, pulled her back. They had struggled. James claimed he had tried to stop Michael, had told him to let her go, but Michael was out of control. Michael had hit Mary Kay, hit her hard enough to knock her down. And then, James said, his voice barely a whisper, Michael had stabbed her, over and over, in a frenzy, while James watched in horror. Lisa listened to this story with skepticism. It was convenient for James to blame everything on a dead man, to paint himself as a helpless bystander. But the DNA evidence told a different story. Mary Kay had scratched James. That meant he had been close to her, close enough that she had fought him too. He was not just a witness. He was a participant. Lisa confronted James with this fact. The DNA under Mary Kay's fingernails was his. That meant Mary Kay had fought him. Sue had tried to defend herself against him. He could not claim to be an innocent bystander when the victim's own body carried evidence of his involvement. James's face crumbled. He put his head in his hands and wept. Finally, he admitted the full truth. Both he and Michael had attacked Mary Kay. Both of them had hit her. When she fought back, scratching and clawing, James had been the one she had marked. He had been holding her arms while Michael stabbed her. He had been part of it, fully, completely, from the moment they decided not to take her home to the moment they left her body on the side of that road. They had driven away, disposed of the weapon, cleaned the car, and gone on with their lives as if nothing had happened. They had made a pact never to speak of it, never to tell anyone. And for 50 years they had kept that pact. Until now. Lisa asked James why they had done it. What possible reason could justify what they had done to Mary Kay? James had no answer. He mumbled something about being drunk, about being young and stupid, about not thinking. But these were not reasons. They were excuses. The truth was that two men had taken a 17-year-old girl, brutalized her, and killed her for no reason other than their own cruelty and cowardice. With James Peterson's confession and the DNA evidence, the case against him was solid. The prosecutor's office charged him with first-degree murder. News of the arrest spread quickly through Wahoo. After more than 50 years, Mary Kay Heese's killer had been identified and arrested. For many in the community, particularly those old enough to remember the crime, the news was stunning. James Peterson, a name some remembered, others had forgotten. He had lived among them, worked among them, and carried the secret of what he had done for half a century. For the Heese family, the arrest brought a complex mixture of emotions. Helen Heese, now in her 90s, was still alive to see this day. When Detective Martinez called to inform her of the arrest, Helen wept. For 50 years she had prayed for answers, for justice, for some resolution to the nightmare that had consumed her life. And now, finally, it had come. But it came too late for her husband, who had died a decade earlier, never knowing who had killed their daughter. It came too late for Mary Kay's siblings, who had grown old, living in the shadow of their sister's murder. Justice delayed is justice denied, the saying goes, and while Helen was grateful for the arrest, she also felt the crushing weight of all those lost years. The trial was scheduled for the following year, 2019. James Peterson's defense attorney, a public defender named Mark Sullivan, faced an uphill battle. The DNA evidence was damning. The confession, even with James's attempts to minimize his role, was devastating. Mark's best option was to negotiate a plea deal, to spare his client the possibility of death penalty in exchange for a full confession and a sentence of life without parole. But James, surprisingly, refused. He wanted to go to trial. He wanted, he said, to tell his story in his own words. Mark tried to dissuade him. A trial would mean reliving the details of the crime publicly. It would mean the Heese family hearing every horrific moment described in open court. It would mean facing a jury that had already read about the case in the newspapers, that had already formed opinions. But James was insistent. Mark reluctantly agreed to represent him at trial. The trial began in September 2019. The courthouse in Wahoo was packed. Media from across the country descended on the small town, drawn by the story of a cold case solved after more than 50 years. The CBS program, 48 Hours, which had originally covered Mary Kay's case in 1999, sent a crew to document the trial. Producer Sarah Chen, who had first told Mary Kay's story 2 decades earlier, sat in the courtroom every day, watching as the case she had once featured reached its conclusion. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Chen, no relation to Sarah, presented a methodical and devastating case. She introduced the DNA evidence, walking the jury through the science of genetic genealogy, explaining how investigators had used cutting-edge technology to identify James Peterson. She played portions of James's confession, letting the jury hear in his own words what he and Michael Garrett had done to Mary Kay Heese. She presented testimony from forensic experts who described Mary Kay's injuries, the brutality of the attack, the evidence that she had fought desperately for her life. Rebecca also introduced evidence from the original investigation. She showed photographs of the crime scene, of Mary Kay's body lying on that rural road. She called witnesses who had known Mary Kay, who testified about her character, her dreams, the kind of person she had been. She wanted the jury to see Mary Kay not just as a victim, but as a real person, someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone whose life had been stolen. The defense's strategy was to argue that while James had been present during the murder, Michael Garrett had been the primary aggressor. Mark Sullivan portrayed his client as a weak man who had been dominated by a more violent friend, who had made terrible choices but had not been the driving force behind the crime. He called no witnesses, relying instead on his cross-examination of prosecution witnesses and his closing argument to make his case. but the prosecution had anticipated this defense. Rebecca Chen pointed out that Mary Kay's DNA evidence implicated James directly. She argued that even if Michael Garrett had struck the first blow, James was an active participant. He had held Mary Kay down. He had helped kill her. He had helped dispose of evidence. He had kept silent for 50 years while Mary Kay's family suffered. Under the law, he was just as guilty as if he had wielded the knife himself. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Helen Heese sat in the front row, flanked by her surviving children and grandchildren. Across the aisle, James Peterson stood beside his attorney, his face pale and drawn. The jury foreman stood and read the verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. Helen Heese closed her eyes and wept. Around her, family members embraced, tears flowing freely. James Peterson showed no reaction. He simply stood there, staring straight ahead, as if he were somewhere else entirely. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month. At the sentencing hearing, members of the Heese family were given the opportunity to address the court and to speak directly to James Peterson. Helen, frail but determined, rose from her seat with the help of her daughter. She walked slowly to the podium and looked at the man who had killed her child. For a long moment, she said nothing, simply stared at him. And in that silence was a world of grief and anger and loss. Then she spoke. Her voice was quiet but steady. She told James Peterson what he had taken from her. Not just Mary Kay's life, but Helen's own life, stolen piece by piece over 50 years of wandering and suffering. She described what it was like to wake up every morning not knowing who had hurt her daughter, to see other families intact while hers was shattered, to die a little more each day from the weight of unanswered questions. She told him that she had prayed for this moment, prayed to live long enough to see him held accountable. And she told him that while she forgave him, because her faith demanded forgiveness, she would never forget what he had done. Other family members spoke as well. Mary Kay's younger brother, now in his 60s, described growing up in the shadow of his sister's murder, how it had shaped his entire life, how he had carried the weight of her absence every single day. Mary Kay's best friend, Jennifer Morrison, now a grandmother herself, spoke about the hole Mary Kay's death had left in her life. How she still thought about her friend, still wondered what Mary Kay would have become if she had been allowed to live. When the victim impact statements were complete, the judge addressed James Peterson. He noted the severity of the crime, the suffering caused, the decades of deception. He sentenced James Peterson to life in prison without the possibility of parole. James would die behind bars, just as Mary Kay had died on that road 50 years earlier. The judge's final words were for the Heese family. He hoped that this verdict would bring them some measure of peace, some sense that justice, though delayed, had finally been served. James Peterson was led from the courtroom in handcuffs. As he passed the row where Helen Heese sat, he paused for just a moment and looked at her. Their eyes met. What passed between them in that instant was known only to the two of them. Then he was gone, led away to begin serving his sentence. Outside the courthouse, Detective Lisa Martinez stood on the steps and spoke to the gathered media. She praised the work of all the investigators who had contributed to solving the case, from those who had worked it in 1969 to the forensic scientists who had made the DNA breakthrough possible. She emphasized that cold cases were never truly closed, that advances in technology meant that even decades-old crimes could be solved. She hoped that Mary Kay's case would inspire other jurisdictions to revisit their unsolved murders, to apply new techniques, to never give up on seeking justice for victims. Sarah Chen, the 48 Hours producer, approached Lisa after the press conference. The two women embraced. Sarah thanked Lisa for her dedication, for never giving up on Mary Kay. Lisa thanked Sarah for keeping the case in the public eye, for producing the episode in 1999 that had kept people talking about Mary Kay. They agreed that it had taken an entire community, spanning decades, to finally bring James Peterson to justice. In the months following the trial, Sarah Chen and her team at 48 Hours worked on a new episode about Mary Kay's case. They had unprecedented access to the investigation, to the trial footage, to interviews with everyone involved. Sarah was given access to the archived material from the 1999 episode, the footage that had never aired, including extended interviews with Helen Heese and the original investigators. This material was now historically significant, capturing voices and faces from a different era, preserving their memories for posterity. The new episode, entitled The Girl from Wahoo, aired on CBS in February 2026, almost exactly 57 years after Mary Kay's murder. It was a comprehensive and deeply moving piece of journalism. Sarah structured the episode to tell the story chronologically, beginning with that March day in 1969, and following the investigation through 5 decades of frustration, hope, technological advancement, and finally resolution. She interwove interviews from 1999 with new interviews conducted in 2025 and 2026, creating a narrative that spanned generations. The episode included footage of Mary Kay's family, showing their grief and their gratitude. It included interviews with Detective Lisa Martinez, who described the painstaking process of building the case using genetic genealogy. It included courtroom footage from the trial, showing James Peterson's confession being played for the jury, showing the moment the verdict was read. And it included Sarah's own reflections on covering the case over 2 decades, on meeting Helen Heese as an elderly woman still fighting for her daughter, on witnessing the conclusion of a story she had thought might never end. The episode resonated deeply with viewers. It became one of the most watched 48 Hours episodes of the year. Social media lit up with discussions about the case, about the persistence of Mary Kay's family, about the dedication of investigators, about the power of technology to solve crimes that had seemed unsolvable. Many viewers commented that they were moved to tears by Helen Heese's testimony at the sentencing hearing, by her grace and strength in the face of unimaginable loss. In Wahoo, the episode's airing was a major event. Many residents gathered in groups to watch it together, to remember Mary Kay, to reflect on how the case had affected their community. For those who had been alive in 1969, it was a journey back in time, a remembering of innocence lost. For younger residents who had only heard stories about the murder, it was a revelation, a deeper understanding of a tragedy that had shaped their town's history. For Helen Heese, watching the episode was bittersweet. At 93 years old, she knew that her time was limited. But she had lived to see justice for Mary Kay, had lived to see her daughter's story told completely and honestly. A few weeks after the episode aired, Helen passed away peacefully in her sleep, or surrounded by family. Her obituary noted that she was finally reunited with her beloved daughter and husband, and that she had devoted her life to seeking justice for Mary Kay. The Heese family held a memorial service that combined elements of Helen's funeral with a remembrance of Mary Kay. The church was filled with people from multiple generations, all connected by the story that had begun 57 years earlier. Detective Lisa Martinez attended, as did Sarah Chen and several members of the 48 Hours crew. They had all become part of Mary Kay's story, their lives intertwined with hers in ways none of them could have predicted. During the service, Mary Kay's younger brother spoke about his mother and sister. He described how Helen had never given up hope, never stopped fighting. "I never stopped believing that the truth would eventually come out." He described Mary Kay as she had been in life, vibrant, loving, full of potential. He thanked everyone who had worked on the case, who had kept Mary Kay's memory alive, who had ensured that she was not forgotten. And he expressed his hope that his mother and sister were together now, at peace, knowing that justice had been achieved. The case of Mary Kay Heese became a landmark in the field of forensic genealogy. Law enforcement agencies across the country studied how the Wahoo Police Department and Nebraska State Patrol had used genetic genealogy to solve a 50-year-old murder. The techniques employed became a model for other jurisdictions working cold cases. Several other unsolved murders were subsequently solved using similar methods, bringing closure to families who, or like the Heeses, had waited decades for answers. James Peterson remained in prison. He gave no interviews, made no public statements, and withdrew into himself. Prison records indicated that he was a model inmate, causing no trouble, following all rules. But he also showed no remorse beyond what he had expressed at trial. Psychologists who evaluated him noted that he seemed emotionally detached from the crime, as if it had happened to someone else. Whether this was a defense mechanism or a fundamental lack of empathy was unclear. Detective Lisa Martinez continued her work on cold cases. Mary Kay's case had given her a sense of purpose, a conviction that no matter how much time had passed, justice was always worth pursuing. She became an advocate for funding and resources for cold case investigations, speaking at conferences, on training other investigators, pushing for legislation that would support this work. She often spoke about Mary Kay, using her story to illustrate why cold cases mattered, why victims deserved justice no matter how many years had passed. Sarah Chen also continued her work at 48 Hours. The Mary Kay Heese episodes, both the original from 1999 and the follow-up from 2026, became some of the most celebrated pieces in the program's history. Sarah won several journalism awards for her coverage, but she always said that the real credit belonged to Helen Heese, to Detective Martinez, to everyone who had refused to let Mary Kay be forgotten. In Wahoo, life went on as it always does, but the town was changed by the resolution of Mary Kay's case. There was a sense of collective relief, a feeling that a long shadow had finally lifted. The Wahoo High School established a scholarship in Mary Kay's name, awarded annually to a junior girl who exemplified the qualities Mary Kay had possessed: kindness, determination, and a commitment to helping others. Each year at the scholarship ceremony, Mary Kay's story was told to a new generation of students, ensuring that she would never be forgotten. The intersection where Dorothy Sullivan had seen Mary Kay get into that car was marked with a small memorial plaque. It read, "In memory of Mary Kay Heese, 1951 to 1969, beloved daughter, sister, and friend. Justice delayed but not denied. People would sometimes stop there, read the plaque, and stand in quiet reflection. Some left flowers. Others simply paused for a moment of silence. 57 years after that terrible March day, Mary Kay Heese's legacy endured. Her story became a testament to the persistence of love and the long arc of justice. It demonstrated that truth, no matter how deeply buried, can eventually come to light. It showed that families who refuse to give up, investigators who refuse to quit, and communities that refuse to forget can change the course of history. Mary Kay's life had been cut short, but her impact rippled forward through the decades, touching countless lives, inspiring change, and ultimately proving that even the coldest cases can be solved. The episode, The Girl from Wahoo, continues to be shared and discussed on social media, introduced to new audiences, used in criminal justice classrooms as a teaching tool. Young people discovering the case for the first time are moved by Mary Kay's story and inspired by Helen's perseverance. Aspiring forensic scientists cite the case as motivation for their chosen careers. Victims' rights advocates reference it when arguing for resources and attention to be devoted to cold cases. Mary Kay Heese was 17 years old when she died, but her story has lived far beyond her years. It has become a part of American true crime history, a reminder that justice, though sometimes glacially slow, can arrive. It has become a source of hope for other families waiting for answers. And it has become a warning to those who commit crimes and think they have escaped. Technology advances, techniques improve, and dedicated investigators never truly stop working. The past can reach forward and find you, no matter how many years have passed. So if you've followed Mary Kay's story to this end, if you felt the frustration of decades without answers and the catharsis of justice finally served, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button if this story moved you. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts about Mary Kay's case, about Helen's strength, about the investigators who never gave up. Your engagement helps ensure that stories like Mary Kay's continue to be told, that victims are remembered, and that the pursuit of justice remains a priority. Because every case, every victim, every family deserves to have their story heard and their truth acknowledged. Mary Kay Heese got her justice after 57 years. Her story proves that it's never too late to do what's right,